Hi guys, just want to talk to you in this video about the advantages and limitations of both anti-spin and long pips. My first go through of this video basically turned into a repeat of my basic equipment recommendations video, and I really didn't want to just go over the same old ground. A lot of it's been covered in there anyway in terms of what rubbers suit attackers and defenders and close to the table players. I don't really want to go over all that again. I really just want to focus here on basically come to the point of, with something like anti-spin, okay, what are its advantages compared to a normal rubber, compared to long pips? What are the limitations of it? And the same for long pips. When we're talking about, say, anti-spin here, when you're thinking in terms of, okay, what are the advantages of anti-spin? Why would you use it? Well, you're usually using this, okay, firstly for variation to the inverted rubber side. Sure, okay, that's one thing. And that's really the same for long pips. Use it, long pips or anti-spin combined with a normal inverted rubber allows you to gain a lot of confusing deception and variation by turning the bat around, or even not turning the bat around but just playing different sides. That change in effect of the rubbers can have a sort of make your opponent's life very difficult. So sure, there is that. That's not really part of the natural advantage or disadvantage of the rubbers. That's just the fact that they're different to normal inverted rubber. So let's get a little bit more talking about actually the rubbers themselves. Now when we're talking about anti-spin, advantages of anti-spin are firstly usually that, in terms of these alternative rubbers, anti-spin is usually going to be the easiest to control. Okay? It will be easier to handle. There's less strange effects when you try and do things. It's less likely to jump off your bat. Whereas long pips can sometimes be, depending on the long pip, can sometimes be a little bit more awkward to handle in that respect. Also with the anti-spin, you'll find usually attacking with the anti-spin is usually easier as well. So for those of you looking to play a close to the table game, and you also want that extra consistency, anti-spin provides that because its control and its feel is usually a little bit more consistent than the long pips versions. Okay, so those are a couple of the advantages in the nature of the anti-spin itself. Also, other advantages that you can get from it is because of this control. It gets that control because it handles, or basically doesn't get affected by spin or your opponent's spin as much. The spin just slides off and really doesn't grip on your bat. So this is an advantage of anti-spin, is that because your opponent's spin isn't affecting you very much, you can place the ball almost where you want it to go. And the other advantage is it tends to give it back to your opponent, so he has to deal with his own spin. So again, another advantage. Another advantage from there is basically that with the types of sponge you use, if you're using a sponge that has deadening properties, that doesn't allow the ball to bounce too much off it, you can also, to a great extent, absorb your opponent's power and drop the ball, keep the ball short, and play a good short game, and only then attack when you wish with the anti or with the inverted side. So this absorption or easier handling of your opponent's pace and power can also be a very good advantage of anti-spin in itself. Now, talking about limitations, what are anti-spin's limitations? Well, generally speaking, what you're always going to in any of these rubbers, anything that you have gains in one area is always going to be made up by losses in somewhere else. So in the anti-spin area, we've made some gains in the fact that it's not affected by our opponent's spin and can quite often absorb his pace. Well, those are going to be also, to a certain extent, the downsides. And because it doesn't react very much to spin, it limits your ability to generate it. So if the ball is low and tight on the table, you're going to have a lot of problems with anti-spin picking that ball up and attacking it. Okay? You'll lose the ability to chop a heavy spin in because the anti-spin's just not going to grip like that. So to a certain extent, what you're doing is you're gaining control at the sacrifice of your ability to vary spin and decide how the shot is going to be played with anti-spin, because you can't control the spin on the ball as much, you can't vary it as much. You can get around it by twiddling to your inverted side and doing it, but the actual limitation of the anti-spin is that once your opponent decides what spins on the ball, your anti-spin is not going to change it very much, and that is a limitation, okay, for sure, a big limitation of anti-spin. Now you can it may not be important in terms of your game, you may get around that by twiddling, you may not care, you may, whatever your opponent does, you use the anti-spin in such a way that you work with his spin. If he gives you no spin, you may be happy to just keep the ball short or again to twiddle. But as in terms of the limitation of the rubber, it is a big limitation in itself, is the lack of ability to generate or to vary the spin that's on the ball. Speaking now, say in terms of long pips, I'm going to really lump in both long pips with and without sponge together. Again, we have that ability to vary spin and give your opponent a hard time by just changing between the inverted and the long pips itself. Sure. But what advantages have you got in long pips as part of their nature? Well, first one that I would suggest is that although it doesn't react, it almost reacts in a lot of ways the opposite to an inverted rubber. And anti-spin does this to a certain extent too. It has that spin reversal capability as well. But with the long pips, you not only have that ability there, but you have the ability to vary the spin with a little bit more range than with anti-spin. With anti-spin, you're certainly limited to what your opponent's more or less putting on the ball. With long pips, you have the ability to generally kill the spin on the ball and take the spin off it. You also have the ability to a certain extent to add a little bit more of that type of spin on the ball that your opponent has put. And depending on your technique and depending on your willingness to take risks, you may with long pips also be able to reverse the spin a little. And I do mean a little here. It's not at all necessarily easy, and it's not a big effect. If your opponent has put a big heavy backspin on the ball, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to chop and produce backspin of your own. You may be able to kill the spin to a certain extent, deaden it. You may be able to roll and add to his backspin, turning it to even more topspin. But to actually reverse it and change it into backspin of your own, that's very, very difficult with any long pimpled rubber, regardless of how good your technique is or what pips you're using. That's still pretty darn tough. So you do get a wider range of variation. It's never going to be as wide as what you get with an inverted rubber because of the inherent nature of long pips. They don't grip as much. So yeah, that's one area of it. But you do have a little bit more ability to vary than anti-spin. So a definite advantage over anti-spin in that respect. A disadvantage, I guess, over the anti-spin is less control in most cases. Pound for pound, you'll usually find in any situation the anti-spin is going to be easier to control than the long pips. It may not be much difference in a lot of the situations. We may be talking about a very small difference between the anti-spin and the long pips, but generally there is that slight difference. Slightly easier to control with the anti-spin. However, the effects of the long pips, the ability to wobble the ball, make it float and dip and go sideways, that ability is definitely easier with long pips than to do with an anti-spin rubber. I've never seen a lot of dip and wobble and from an anti-spin. That's usually restricted to your long pips. In terms of attacking though, your long pips are going to be harder to attack with than the anti-spin as well. So we're looking at advantages of the long pips themselves, also easier to handle your opponent's heavy topspin ball, much easier to handle, very good for long range defence and chopping. If you've got a nice dead sponge on it, underneath your long pips, it can also have a good absorption of pace and keep the ball short. So there is that advantage as well. It can do that quite well too. The trade-off again being that if you're going to use a long pip that absorbs a lot of pace, you're going to limit your ability to hit with any pace with it. And compared to an anti-spin, it's much tougher to generate offense with long pips than with the anti-spin. You can use the long pips to set up a lot of offense, to set up your inverted rubber, but not generally as easy to actually attack with them as it is with the anti-spin themselves. So usually you'll find your long pips are more of a setup, whereas the anti-spin can actually be the offensive weapon itself. Now that's not to say there aren't players who do hit and roll and play aggressively with their long pips. Sure, there are. But what they're doing is they're actually doing a very good job of working against the basic nature of long pips and doing a good job despite it, rather than really sort of saying, well, the long pips are great for attacking. Because in general, they're not. And what you will find is that usually what's happening is the aggressive play with long pips, the reason it's effective is because of the contrast to the inverted side, not because long pips themselves are wonderful offensive weapons. Otherwise, if they were, you could put long pips on both sides of your racket and try and attack with them. But you don't see a lot of players doing that, simply because they're not that great at attacking. Also the same reason why you don't see a lot of anti-spin on both sides. Because they do have offensive capabilities, but there's nowhere near the same range as you get with an inverted rubber, and also a lot of that advantage is from the fact that the difference between the long pips or the anti-spin compared to the inverted is that's a lot of your weapon as well. So really just looking, those are kind of like when we're talking about these advantages, limitations, those are the basic ones. What I just want to stress just at the finish here, so that I'm not sort of waffling on forever. Any rubber, whether you're talking about a long pip, an anti-spin or the inverted rubber, any rubber has compromises. They're designed for specific purposes. Okay? Now, you're never going to get a rubber that does everything well. It just doesn't exist. Okay? With inverted rubbers, the ability of the inverted rubber has a wider variation. It can do more things. You know, it's more generalised, and within that wide range of variations, there are all the way to say this side. There's the chopping rubbers with great control, sometimes good spin, and not a lot of pace usually, all the way through to the tensor, high speed, high spin, fast, bouncy, and then in the middle the Shrivers, the Mark Vs. So with those normal rubbers you have a wide range of variation. Now, why don't they do them all? What's the trade-off, I guess is what I'm getting at. If they've got good speed, good spin, where's your trade-off? Well, usually it's the control of the ball. It's tougher to control because you have to get the right bat angle, you have to get the right swing speed, you have to get the right amount of brush on the ball. So you have to provide the right control to a certain extent, especially at the pacier rubbers at this end of the spectrum. At this end of the spectrum, what you'll generally find is the control, the pace is less, sometimes the spin is less, but often the spin is still pretty strong. But usually the pace is going to be a lot less with defensive rubbers. That ups your control and makes usually your bat angle a little bit easier, but you're losing some pace. So within this wide spectrum, there is compromises. You can't have everything. And it's the same when we talk about an anti-spin or we talk about a long pip. They're a very much more specialised rubber. We're talking about a very narrower band of their characteristics compared to an inverted rubber going all the way from chopping inverted rubbers to aggressive inverted rubbers. When we talk about long pips or anti-spin, we're talking about very much less difference between a defensive long pip and an aggressive long pip, or a defensive anti-spin and aggressive anti-spin. Much narrower banding, but there's still that compromise within the band of an aggressive long pip is going to be harder to chop with. An aggressive anti-spin, harder to chop with. A defensive long pip, probably going to be better control, harder to attack with. And the same with the anti-spin. And there's also, in terms of the anti-spin or long pips themselves, when we talk about what you're trading off, is while you're gaining usually control with anti-spin, some control of heavy topspin with the long pips, and some wobbling and deceptive effects as well, but you're losing offensive capability to a large extent. And that's the trade-off you've got to make. Now the final point that I was just getting to is that basically when you talk about, and when players get together and talk about, what rubber should I be using? Should I be using this rubber? Should I be using that rubber? Everybody wants to find the perfect rubber, the one that does it all and does it all well. Okay, there is no such thing, and if you can take that away more than anything else, you'll probably be well served from this video. There is no long pip that chops really, really well, that blocks really, really well, that wobbles all over the place, and that attacks really, really well. Okay, I've yet to see a long pip that does all of that. Okay, there are long pips that chop very well and that control the ball, the topspin very well, but usually you're not going to attack too much greatly with them. There's always something that they don't do so well. There are long pips that are quite good for attacking, but they're not going to chop as well. And the same with the anti-spin. There is no perfect long pip or anti-spin that does the whole range of what anti-spins and long pips do well. That chops well, blocks well, wobbles, and is easy to attack. Okay? Doesn't exist. That's not important because usually with our styles, we're not looking for one that does it all. Okay, it would be nice if it existed. That would be great, but it doesn't. So what your job is to basically say, okay, for my style, I stand, perhaps you might be saying, okay, I stand close to the table. Okay, I don't need a rubber that chops really well because I don't go back and chop. Okay, I'm looking for a rubber that wobbles all over the place, that gives me decent control, enough to control the ball on the table and keep it on so the wobble takes effect and allows me to hit. Okay, if I can find one that actually gives me a little bit more control and does the wobbling and does the hitting, then great. But my main concerns are I need to be able to hit with it and I need it to wobble. And then the controls next, and last is how well it chops. And that's what you're going to have to think of in terms of when you're thinking of your advantages and limitations of these rubbers, is you've got to mix and match the advantages and limitations to your own style. Okay? Speaking from personal experience, I'm using a long pip rubber that chops very well against topspin. Okay? That has very good control, quite good variation in spin from it. Is okay for hitting. It's not bad for hitting, but it's not great. It's not the best one I've ever seen for hitting as well, and has virtually no wobble. Doesn't wobble or dip or anything really at all. But again, from my criteria, I'm usually, when I'm using my long pips, I'm quite often using them from 2 metres, 3 metres back from the table. I don't need the ball wobbling. It won't help me. If I'm close to the table, the wobble would be useful. From that far back, I need a ball that when someone loops a big heavy topspin, I can chop it and know that I'm going to control it, and I can add to his spin or kill the spin and vary with great control. And that's what I need. I need a rubber that does that. And then occasionally when I want to break up the game and hit one, I can get a reasonable result. I then use its change of pace to get the result. I don't need it to be fast to actually hit winners with the long pips. I just use the change of pace itself for the variation to set up my inverted side. And that's what we've really got to do when we're talking advantages and limitations, is you've got to have a good awareness of your game, what you need from your long pips, from your anti-spin, and then be aware of whatever anti-spin or long pip you choose, they're never going to do everything. Okay? There's always going to be some things they don't do so well. And you may get a rubber that's kind of just okay at everything. Well, that can happen. It can chop okay, hit okay, wobble a little bit, and control the ball all right. That may be the rubber that suits you. Other players will need one that does something very much and not a lot of the others. There's very few styles that I've seen that need everything. That would be a true all-round player who's chopping, also standing close, also hitting, and needs good control with everything. There's not a lot of players around who need that. Okay, so just that's really my final point with this video, is really be aware. Every single anti-spin, every single long pip, even every inverted rubber, okay, there are things they'll do well, there are things they won't do so well. You have to match them to your game. And then you have to be aware that if you improve or you change things in your game, that may require a change in your rubber to match your new requirements, your new abilities. And that's also something you have to be aware of. If my knees give in and I can't play defensively 3 metres back from the table, if I have to play close, I'm not going to be using the rubber I use now for my long pips. Not suited, for me at all from that range. I'd be looking for something, probably with some deadening sponge or something like that to suit. And that's really what I'm kind of trying to drive at. Rather than just repeating my basic equipment recommendations, we're really trying to just talk about here basic. Really just get at the fact that you have to be aware of your game and the advantages and limitations of these particular rubbers. Okay. Hi guys. I just wanted to add this really to the my discussion on advantages and limitations of long pips and anti-spin. Just a small demonstration, just to highlight a little bit of what I mean. Now, you've been watching over the last couple of months, there's a lot of video of me using the long pips, me using the anti-spin to both push, roll and hit the ball. Now, in a lot of those videos you've heard me remark that the anti-spin's a lot easier to control. And by watching the video you could basically see me have much better success with the anti-spin hitting the ball. And I can hit harder with much more power with the anti-spin than my long pips, and with a better success rate. Now that would lead you to think that if I can hit harder with the anti-spin than the long pips, to a certain extent, probably my anti-spin bat's faster than the long pip bat. But it's not actually the case. This is just here, if I just bend down for a second, this is my long pip bat that I'm using in all the videos. And this is the one with the anti-spin that I'm using in all the videos. Now, the anti-spin has, I don't know, about a 2 mil sponge on it, whereas the long pips has no sponge. Okay? This is a fairly good example of what I mean. If I take about the same height, roughly, and drop, again, long pip, anti-spin, roughly the same height. So in actual fact, the long pip itself, the anti-spin is actually much less springy or bouncy than the long pip. Now, why is that the case? Well, what's happening with it is that although it's got a softish sponge, it's a softish, deadish sponge. And it's allowing the ball to sink in, but not really allowing the ball itself to bend. As an example, if I use the table and drop it, the table bounces a lot more than the long pips. That being because the table itself is rock hard and allows the ball to keep deforming and bouncing. Okay? So what I'm really just getting at here is that even though the pace of my long pip bat is faster in terms of bounciness than the anti-spin bat, the anti-spin bat is actually the bat that I hit harder with and more successfully with. So it's not always about pace, it's also about control of the ball. If you've got a very fast bat, if this was pure wood, it would be bouncy as heck. It's just like a table, very bouncy. I still wouldn't be able to hit the ball very hard on the other side of the table because I wouldn't have any ability to control the ball. So, although that experiment's quite interesting, what's the point? Well, the point is really just to show you that it's not all about sheer pace. It's also about actually how the rubber characteristics, the advantages and limitations work together to produce the result. In this particular case, although the anti-spin is slower, its nature allows me to control the ball better and hit harder with more success. Whereas with the long pips, I can't do that. What I'm just kind of getting at here is that you have to be aware of the characteristics of the rubber. Okay, it's not always simple. You get it out there, put it on the bat, try it out to see how things work. You can't always just take someone's opinion on a website or read about it. You've got to try it. And you would think the slower bat is going to be the worst for attacking. Well, no. In this case, it's not going to be the worst for attacking. And even though the anti-spin here is slippery, whereas the long pips are grippy, the anti-spin is still better for attacking, provided the ball's above the level of the table, because the control and consistency is so much better. Whereas the long pips with no sponge when attacking, I don't have quite the control that I do with the anti-spin. So it's not always a simple matter. You have to sometimes put a bit of thought in and try things out to actually see the result. And another good example of that is what I was mentioning later in the second month of the course, where I started, instead of that trying to drive the ball with the long pips, where I started to brush loop it and found and discovered that really for that stroke, I do get good control. I don't get pace. It doesn't produce a fast attacking loop, but it does produce excellent control when done correctly. But it's certainly not an aggressive hit through. But it goes to show that sometimes even technique can affect the usefulness of it. Whereas if I would anticipate, if I tried to do that brush loop technique with the anti-spin, I think I'd have a lot of trouble because there's no way to bend the anti-spin. It would tend to just slide right off. So it's definitely a technique I think that would only really be effective with the long pips. So there you go.